Welcome back to Exploring the Old Testament. I'm Dr. Hutchins, and today we want to look at the final 4 books of the 12, or the Minor Prophets, which are also the final 4 books of the Old Testament in our English Bibles. So the first of these final 4 books is Zephaniah. Zephaniah prophesied to the southern kingdom of Judah between about 630 and 620 BC. His message is that God will judge Judah and all nations, but then he will bless all nations. So the first part of the book, chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 8, God will judge Judah and all nations. And then the second part of the book, the final verses 3, 9 to 20, God will bless Judah and all nations. Zephaniah is prophesying about God's universal judgment at the end of time. Zephaniah 1:2 says, "I will completely sweep away everything from the face of the earth." So God is promising to judge Judah for its idolatry, but God will also judge all the other nations. He says, the whole earth will be consumed by the fire of my jealousy. That's Zephaniah 3:8. God is the God of the entire earth, and so all people are accountable to him. And so just in the same way that God's judgment will be universal, his blessing will also be universal to the entire world. He promises to restore pure speech to the peoples, that the confusion of languages that happened at the Tower of Babel will be reversed so that all people will be able to call on the name of the Lord. Both Jew and Gentile will worship God forever. Zephaniah 3:15, God gives the promise, "The Lord has removed your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The King of Israel, the Lord, is among you. You need no longer fear harm." And God has fulfilled this promise through Jesus. By punishing Jesus for sin, he has removed the punishment that we deserve and defeated the enemies of sin, death, and Satan. So in King Jesus, God dwells with his people and gives us security. When Jesus returns, then these promises will be fulfilled perfectly. God will dwell with us forever in a new Jerusalem. The book of Haggai was written to the Jewish people who were returning from the Babylonian exile. In fact, these next 3 books, these last ones, are all written during that time period. So it was written around 520 BC, and the main idea is that God commands the Jews returning from the exile to rebuild the temple. So chapter 1, God commands the rebuilding of the temple. Chapter 2, God encourages the work. So these Jewish people who had come back to the land, the promised land, from their Babylonian exile, they were claiming that it was not yet the time to rebuild the temple. And still, they found the time, they found the resources to build nice homes for themselves. So we see in that action that even though they were not worshiping the idols any longer that had caused the exile, they continued to love other things more than God. They were making idols out of wealth, out of their homes, out of the stability of their lives. And the point of this book is that the worship of God should take priority in our lives over everything else. Now, the temple that was rebuilt by the exiles, we read, seemed like nothing in comparison to the glory of the temple that was built by Solomon. In fact, at the dedication of the foundation of that temple in Ezra chapter 3, verse 12, we see that the old men who had seen the previous temple actually are weeping when they see the foundation because they realize how much inferior this new temple would be compared to the old one. And yet God promises in Haggai 2:9, the final glory of this house will be greater than the first. So this points forward to the glory of the New Jerusalem, where God the Father and God the Son will dwell with their people forever and ever. We will experience their glory. Their glory will fill the entire earth as a temple in the future. The book of Zechariah is the next book. It is written between 520 and 480 BC, again to the Jews returning from the exile. The point of the book is that God's people should find hope in the promise that God's king will come. So chapters 1 through 8, God's people must return to God to prepare for God's return to them. In the first 6 chapters, Zechariah has 8 different visions. In chapters 7 and 8, Zechariah rebukes and then encourages the people. And then in chapters 9 to 14, God's king will come to his people. That's the focus. So Zechariah is focusing on the future fulfillment of God's promises to his people. God had exiled the Jewish people because of their sin. Now the Jewish people have returned to the promised land, but the problem is they have not wholeheartedly returned to God. They hadn't completed the temple, similar as in the previous book. They focused on religious observance like fasting instead of righteous actions like caring for the oppressed and the poor among them. And God promises, of course, to bring prosperity to the people. But first, the people must prepare themselves by turning from their evil ways and returning to God. And so God reveals in Zechariah many promises to the Jewish people about the coming of the king, both a first coming and a second coming of the future king in the line of David, the Messiah. For example, Zechariah 9:9 is where God declares that he will come in peace on a donkey's colt. Yet the king will also be pierced and mourned over in Zechariah 12:10. The shepherd will be struck and the sheep will be scattered in Zechariah 13:7. But after the piercing of the shepherd, of the king, God will wash away sin and impurity in Zechariah 13:1. Then the king will defeat his enemies and establish his eternal kingdom, which will be holy and free from sin in Zechariah 14. So Jesus fulfills these prophecies. Jesus fulfilled Zechariah 9:9 when he entered Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey. After his arrest, the disciples, like sheep, are scattered, fulfilling Zechariah 13:7. On the cross, the Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear, fulfilling Zechariah 12:10. And other prophecies remain to be fulfilled. Zechariah's vision of the defeat of all of God's enemies, the prosperity of his people, the holy kingdom free from sin, they've begun to be fulfilled in believers, but they remain to be fulfilled perfectly at Christ's return. So this book of Zechariah is so important because it gives us so many specific prophecies that are fulfilled in the life and death, resurrection, and return of Jesus Christ. The final book of the Old Testament and of the minor prophets is Malachi, again writing to the Jewish people who have returned from the exile, writing around 430 BC, making it one of the last books that were written of the Old Testament. And the point of the book is that God will judge his people's sin, and then he will return to his people. So chapter 1 through 2:16, God condemns sinful priests and husbands. Chapter 2:17 through 4:6, God will send a messenger before his coming. So Malachi begins by condemning God's people and the priests especially because they offered lame and sick animals as sacrifices. God refuses to accept these kinds of offerings. The priests are profaning God's name because they are giving God the worst of what they have rather than the best. And so God does not accept all worship. This is an important point to be applied even to our own lives. God is not interested in any kind of worship. He deserves only the very best from his people. And similarly, Malachi condemns Jewish men for divorcing their Jewish wives and marrying foreign women who worship idols. By marrying women who worship idols, they have brought impurity to the people of God, and God will not accept people with this kind of half-hearted devotion to him. So Malachi is condemning these people for, even though they're doing some of the right things on the outside, they're not doing it from a full, pure devotion to God, and it's not acceptable to God. God says that he is going to have to prepare the people for his return to the people, and the way he's going to do that is by sending a messenger before God comes to the people. So Malachi 3:1 says, "See, I'm going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me." The messenger is the prophet Elijah in Malachi 4:5, who will come before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. And when he comes, Malachi 4:6, he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. So the messenger who will be similar to Elijah is the final prophet that God will send before he begins to fulfill all his promises of judgment and salvation to his people. And Jesus, he identifies John the Baptist as the messenger that is foretold of in the book of Malachi. John came preaching against the sin of the Jewish people. He baptized those who responded to his preaching with repentance, for the repentance of their sins. And in this way, he prepared for the coming of Jesus, which is the coming of God himself back to his people. So while John was the greatest born among women, according to Jesus, Jesus was still greater. John explained, "I am not the Messiah, but I've been sent ahead of the Messiah. He must increase, but I must decrease." God's coming kingdom would come through King Jesus, but it is John who was sent, John the Baptist, who was sent before Jesus to prepare the way for the king. So it's no accident that our English Bibles puts Malachi at the end of the Old Testament. And then the first things we read about after the birth of Jesus in the book of Matthew is the coming of John the Baptist to fulfill the prophecies of Malachi.